I believe that the island that we're talking about today could be one of the new undiscovered Epstein Islands. And the crimes that are committed here are so bold, so brazen, so out in the open that no one's doing a thing about it. This episode is incredibly disturbing, so please, viewer and listener discretion is advised. For anyone who's read the novel The Lord of the Flies, the story of Pitcairn Island will be a familiar reminder that even in paradise, humanity can quickly lose its way. For those who are unfamiliar, The Lord of the Flies tells the fictional story of a group of young boys trapped on a remote island, where their attempts at self-government lead to infighting and disaster. The tale has long been hailed as an example of humanity at its most wild, and the fragility of the line between civilization and chaos. The Lord of the Flies has always been read as an extreme metaphor for humanity and its darker tendencies. But remarkably, there's a real-life example of a story not too different than the one in the famous book. It's a story that involves mutiny, isolation, and the things humans are willing to do to get what they want, especially when there's no one around to see what they're doing. This is the twisted tale of Pitcairn Island, whose history begins with 18th century sailors and ends with one of the most shocking cases in recent memory, all set in a place that looks like paradise. As always, all parties are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. If you want to research this story on your own, I always post a document in the description of this show that you can click on and you can access to see where the information presented in this show was gathered and drawn from. And as always, I don't want to do anything to myself. I'm not planning on doing anything to myself. And if I go anywhere anytime soon or anything happens to me, at least you know that I didn't do it. Without further ado, welcome to the Conspiracy Files. I'm going to be doing some stories over the next few weeks dealing with islands around the world that have been hotbeds of disturbing behavior. You know, I knew Epstein Island. I knew of that for years before the year 2022, and I had researched Epstein extensively. I had friends that were telling me about him before he was arrested and ostensibly offed. And so I knew that islands were places where things can happen. I mean, it's perfect, especially if it's like a privately owned island. There are no authorities around, no prying eyes. Once you're there, it's basically you and whoever owns the place / is out there. And if you need help on an island, you could scream the loudest that you can possibly scream, and nobody most likely is going to hear you. So then when I'm researching Epstein Island, that's when I first came across North Fox Island, which was the earlier Epstein Island here in Michigan. It was one of my first videos ever here on this channel, and it's a story that I've devoted my life to chasing. You guys are going to see some details about that project that I'm talking about within the year. We're really going at these people that were in that group. But I've had tons of people after putting these videos out that have sent me information about these other islands that are hotbeds for these sorts of things. And every time I'm just disturbed, but I can't say that I'm shocked, because people have been doing this for hundreds, if not thousands of years, taking and the and innocent out to places where they can't be seen and doing unholy things to them out of the prying eyes of most members of society. And Pitcairn Island, this is one example of something like this going on that is so disturbing that it's hard to believe. It's for me one of those stories that was really hard to believe at first before I sat down and really started researching. But anyways, let's just get right into it. First, we have to talk about the history of Pitcairn and its outward appearances. Pitcairn is just one of 4 volcanic islands that rest in the South Pacific, and it only measures roughly 18 square miles. It's a relatively tiny island. It's a spot of stunning greenery and lush plants, surrounded by gorgeous blue sea. But for all of its beauty, Pitcairn Island is as far from modern as you can possibly get. The island has no airstrip and no safe harbor. Visitors must disembark from a larger ship and take a small longboat to reach the shore. And if you want to get there, you are in for quite the journey. First, you'll need to catch multiple flights to Tahiti, which can take 24 hours depending on where you're flying from. From Tahiti, you'll take a 5-hour flight to the island of Mangareva, a ride you can only get once a week. On Mangareva, you'll then board a boat and sail for 3 full days before you finally reach Pitcairn Island. The boat that goes to Pitcairn only leaves once every 3 months, so if you miss it, you'll have a good wait before your next chance. And when you finally arrive at Pitcairn, you'll be there for at least another 3 months before when the next boat comes to take you away. But despite how remote Pitcairn Island is, it's been known by humans for thousands of years. Ancient glyphs found on the island suggest that Polynesian travelers were the first to visit the island, sailing their innovative canoes which were capable of open sea travel. But the people who really put Pitcairn on the map and whose story would directly contribute to the case uncovered in 1999 were a group of sailors from the 18th century. In 1787, a ship called the HMS Bounty left port in England and set sail for Tahiti. After a grueling 10-month journey, they finally arrived at their destination, where they then lingered for another 5 months. While the ship remained docked, its crew spent most of their time on land, enjoying the local food, the local drink, and the women from local communities. For a group of men living the incredibly hard and dangerous life of sailing the open sea in the times before engines and modern navigation, this place was a practical paradise. You had fresh food, you had friendly faces, women to occupy your time with back then. This was like coming across a lagoon in the middle of the desert for these people. It was almost so good it was like some sort of mirage. And finally, when it came time for the crew to push off the island and return to sea, Captain William Bligh found that all of his men were hesitant to leave. Despite their complaints though, William Bligh eventually got his crew back on board, but it wasn't long before the sailors' attitudes went from bad to worse. When a faction of the crew could no longer deal with life back on the sea, they organized a mutiny, an incredibly serious offense that would have earned them back in England. The crime of mutiny on a ship was so forbidden back then, the captain would have had the power to right there the mutineers without a court-martial, a court decision, anything, while they were still at sea. But Captain Bligh wasn't able to maintain control of the ship, and at the end of the ordeal, he and his remaining loyal 18 men were set adrift into the open sea in a small boat. And shockingly, William Bligh did manage to survive, and he somehow navigated his way with his crew in that tiny boat thousands of miles back to land. In the meantime, though, the HMS Bounty was now controlled by the mutineers, including men Fletcher Christian and John Adams. Knowing that they would be in deep trouble back in any English territory, the men then made their way back to Pitcairn Island, where they disembarked and set fire to the HMS Bounty. And in fact, the ship's sunken remains can still be seen today underwater in what is now known as Bounty Bay. On Pitcairn, there were now 9 mutineers and women who had traveled with them from Tahiti, all faced with the task of building a community on the remote speck of land in the middle of the ocean. And today, nearly all the inhabitants of Pitcairn Island are direct descendants of these men and women. The mutineers landed in Pitcairn in 1790, and it would be another 5 years before they even caught a single sight of another ship. And it wouldn't be until 1808, nearly 20 years after they settled down on the island, that any other humans would set foot on their paradise when the crew from an American ship visited for just 10 hours. While those who occasionally visited the island in those early days reported that the islanders seemed well-fed and happy, the gorgeous setting was far from paradise. The community had to start their life from scratch, learning how to survive on the island, and their group was plagued by infighting and gossip, alcoholism, and disease killed many of the inhabitants. And when they were visited in 1808, only 1 man, 9 women, and a few children remained. Despite early trials, the community, however, managed to survive. And incredibly, Pitcairn Island has remained inhabited since 1790, with the population reaching a peak of 233 people in 1937. Since then, however, numbers have steadily declined, and today just about 50 people live on Pitcairn. Modern day life on Pitcairn is a unique experience. The islanders have become expert craftsmen, and their knowledge of how to survive and make use of the setting's resources has been passed down from the original settlers, those mutineers who burned their ship right there in the bay. Supplies come just once every 3 months, and from then until the next boat, Pitcairn is completely cut off from the world. And if you want hot water for a shower, you'll have to chop the wood to feed the boiler. Despite the tough living though, Pitcairn is seen as a mystical and unique place to visit. Tourists are drawn to the island by the opportunity to experience island life at its fullest. When visitors arrive, the island rings a bell to let the community know that new folks are on their way. And during their stay, visitors are ingratiated into the community, sharing meals, learning from the locals, and enjoying the freedom of the remote paradise. For many, the island is one of the few places you can live without the hustle of the modern world, all while surrounded by some of the most stunning scenery that the planet has to offer. But why is a paradise like Pitcairn on a show like this? What could have possibly happened there that would make it so bad that we would have to devote an entire hour to discussing it? Well, the sad fact is that even in a place of immense beauty, but especially when hidden away from prying eyes, human beings can be allowed to exist at their darkest. In the late 90s, frightening rumors began to circulate about Pitcairn Island. It seemed that for as long as people could remember, Pitcairn had been harboring a truly terrible secret, one that turned awful crimes into a normal part of island life. So, despite how small it is, Pitcairn does still have a police force, a team of 2 officers from the United Kingdom who stay roughly 6 months before leaving and being replaced with new officers. In 1999, Gail Cox from the UK was serving her temporary assignment on Pitcairn Island. Like others who visited the island, Gail saw what was on the surface, a tropical haven. She was later quoted as saying, "A lot of people are romanced by the place and I fell for it. I saw the community through rose-colored glasses. I thought it was this really idyllic place and everybody was really nice." End quote. But Gail Cox soon learned that behind the seeming paradise of island life, Pitcairn was a cesspool of behavior, as would be shockingly uncovered over the next coming months. And in 1999, the spark that lit the Pitcairn flame was struck. During that year, Gail Cox learned that 2 girls had been abducted on the island by a man named Ricky Quinn. Ricky was a New Zealander who was visiting Pitcairn Island at the time. The young girls reported that not only had they been abducted by Ricky, but they had also been by Randy Christian, a Pitcairn native. And so Gail Cox called in the situation to her superiors in the United Kingdom right away. When the officer spoke with Leon Salt, the commissioner of Pitcairn, he replied, quote, "If we dig into this, we'll open a right can of worms, and we'll have every man on Pitcairn locked up for life." End quote. It was a chilling statement, and it showed that at least some British officials had an inkling that things weren't quite right on the island. Well, at first, the islanders seemed outraged with Ricky Quinn, who admitted to Gail Cox, the officer, that he had indeed been to the girls. But soon, that attitude seemed to change. Suddenly, Gail found that the people of the island were rallying against her, with claims that she was interfering with their own private matters. Kathy Marks, one of the few reporters who would later be allowed on the island during the trials, wrote, quote, "Moreover, news had spread that the girls were accusing local men of similar offenses. And who knew where that would lead? It was the start of the community resistance that was to characterize the case for years to come." End quote. Less than a week after the initial accusations, one of the young girls reported to Gail Cox that Randy Christian's younger brother, Sean, had raped her as well. She reported that the had begun at the age of, and that at one point, both of the brothers had raped her at the same time. Now, Gail Cox, who had never dealt with a case in the past, was shocked by these reports. She did her best to take all the notes she could and assured the girl and her family that all would be well and everything would work itself out. And with her reports made back to the officials in the United Kingdom, Gail Cox's time on the island drew to a close. In the days leading up to her departure, she felt open hostility from the people on the island. They were enraged that she had reported the actions of the Christian brothers to officials. To them, she was airing private business to outsiders. This was a community that wanted to handle things on its own, and they didn't take kindly to Cox interfering with their way of life. When she left, Gail's once idyllic view of Pitcairn Island was completely shattered. She was quoted as saying, "I felt dead inside, emotionally numb. I really loved that community and I cared about them. I felt so disappointed, so deeply betrayed." End quote. Meanwhile, officials in Wellington, New Zealand and London, England were coming to terms with the problem that they were experiencing on Pitcairn. So far, there were only the 2 making claims, but after 2 centuries of being out of sight and out of mind, the police immediately began to worry that the island had developed a dark habit of girls and teenagers. Martin Williams, who was the governor of Pitcairn at one time, wrote, quote, "I have no doubt that these are not unique cases. It is far more likely that they are a continuation of a pattern that has been going on for 200 years, end quote. Any complacency that UK officials had about monitoring Pitcairn was now replaced with an urgency to investigate, despite the difficulties that would come from working in such an isolated setting with no significant system of laws. The Foreign Office began and funded Operation Unique, which was tasked with learning about the and the crimes that occurred on the island. Detectives Peter George and Robert Vinson were immediately assigned to the case, and they began by speaking with Randy and Sean Christian, who had left Pitcairn Island at that point and were then living in Australia. When George and Vinson, the investigators, interviewed those brothers, they both denied the allegations that had been made about them, although they did admit to having with an underage girl named Catherine, who had moved from Pitcairn to New Zealand. When the detectives visited Catherine and asked her about the incidents, she was completely frank in a way that they hadn't anticipated. Catherine named several men besides Randy and Sean Christian who had raped her while she was underage, and she didn't seem particularly bothered by recounting the grisly details. To her, all this was completely normal. She talked about it blasé as if this was, a trip to the grocery store or cooking dinner at home. It was completely normal to her. And that, to the investigators, was a massive red flag. It was one thing to have a few offenders who had one or two on an island, but what could life have been like on Pitcairn if had been so normalized? I mean, keep in mind, there was only a few dozen people living on the island at this time, and this girl's blaming practically half the island, saying that they had her while she was a kid. Catherine, the victim, also told the investigators George and Vinson that on Pitcairn, quote, "You won't get a girl reaching the age of that's still a," end quote. She told the shocked detectives that it was an accepted part of life on the island that everyone knew about, but no one minded. To the people born and raised on the island, you were supposed to lose your by the age of. It was mandatory. That was just what people did. And so when George and Vincent reported their findings to their superiors, they immediately drew some concerns. Britain was worried that the case would reflect poorly on them for having so mismanaged the island. Knowing that so many people were interested in the story and mythos of Pitcairn, they also worried about the negative publicity. But Catherine's statement was too huge to ignore, so the detectives soon got new orders. George and Vincent were to trace and speak with every woman who had been born and raised on Pitcairn since 1980 to see how deep this had been running. They started by tracking women down who had since moved away from the island, about 20 in total, and they asked them about their experiences. They weren't prepared, though, for what they were about to learn. George, one of the investigators, later recalled that at every house the investigators visited, quote, "We got the same response. Every Pitcairn girl, and I mean every single one, a 100% hit, had been a victim of to varying degrees," end quote. Vincent said, quote, "We got disclosure after disclosure. It was staggering. It was like opening the floodgates for some of these women," end quote. The victims that the detectives spoke with reported a wide swath of different, from indecent exposures to full-on. Most of the victims named more than one man as their, and several reported that the had started when they were between 5 years old. And that was just what they were learning from women who had left Pitcairn. What would the women and children still living on the island tell them? Seeing how deep the case was going to go, George and Vincent began speaking with women beyond the 1980s cutoff. And by the time they were done, they had identified a total of 31, including 2 men. The had identified a group of about 30 different offenders, 27 of whom were native to Pitcairn. A few of them, though, were visitors to the island. Roughly a dozen women had made reports against their own brothers, uncles, and fathers, saying that they were from the age of. The small size of the population and their interconnectedness only complicated matters as well. Quote, "With every who was tracked down, the connections between those involved grew ever more excruciatingly tangled," end quote, said Marks. That interconnectedness also meant that by the time the detectives had spoken with everyone who had moved away from the island, those back on Pitcairn knew that they would soon be visited by the investigators too. In September of 2000, George and Vincent made the long journey to Pitcairn Island and arrived at the community, where they were surprised by the warm welcome. George later said, quote, "We were greeted with open arms, even by the accused. Residents were even bringing us fish and freshly baked cakes. It was surreal," end quote. Once on the island, the detectives began interviewing nearly all of the inhabitants, and it became clear that not only was rampant and underage happening on the island, but that the community and all the adults in it had almost no problem with it. If Pitcairn was a paradise for anyone in particular, it was a paradise for who wanted to visit the island to and fulfill absolutely any of their wishes. These crimes against were seen as just another part of life on Pitcairn, and many of the community members didn't understand what the police were getting so worked up about. They had been so isolated and brought up like this, taught to behave like this, that this was completely normal to the adults on the island, and they had no idea that this was looked at wrong in other parts of the world. Eva Lerner, a social worker who went to the island with the detectives, wrote that the community didn't understand, quote, why the matters being investigated were of concern, or how they might be damaging to young women and children, end quote. You see, every single person on the island of Pitcairn seemed to know and accept that girls were being raped while they were underage, starting at the age of just. And it wasn't just one or two men responsible for these, but it was nearly every single young man on the island. But despite the seeming normalization of the some visitors to Pitcairn had noticed something was wrong and had even tried to right the ship before the revelation of 1999. One of those visitors was Pastor Neville Towson, who had stayed on the island with his wife, Rhonda. Right away, Neville thought the children's conduct seemed off. Quote, I noticed worrying signs such as inexplicable mood swings. It took me 3 months to realize they were being, end quote. When Neville finally learned the staggering depth of the crimes, he struggled to come to terms with how those on the island could let this continue for so long. He and his wife also began to feel more and more uncomfortable while they were there on Pitcairn, but they weren't able to wrangle help and they weren't able to leave. Remember, that ship only comes every few months. It seemed that every time Neville needed to use the communal satellite telephone to contact someone who didn't live on the island, it happened to not be working. Quote, we couldn't get a message out of Pitcairn, he said. We couldn't even contact our kids. I also wrote letters to the church administration saying I was concerned about the things on the island. They never arrived, end quote. In desperation, Neville and his wife Rhonda spoke to the Pitcairn matriarchs, the mothers of the island, saying, quote, we said to them, where were you when this was going on? You're the elders of the island. Surely you must be unhappy, and they replied that nothing had changed. One of the grandmothers said, we all went through it. It's part of life on Pitcairn. She said she couldn't understand what all the fuss was about, end quote. So while the presence of the police in 2000 made the islanders a little nervous, they didn't seem overly concerned. Some thought that with the difficulty of trying crimes on Pitcairn, the matter would just go away on its own. Police officer Karen Vaughn said, quote, they thought we'd go there once and then realize how difficult logistically it was to pursue. The men just thought they could get away with it, end quote. But any lax policy the UK had towards Pitcairn had now disappeared, and they seemed committed to pursuing the case and bringing these people to justice. By mid-2001, the detectives and police had conducted countless interviews and built up their evidence. But now came the hard part, finding a way to set up a court and put away the criminals amidst a growing local outrage on an island that had never even had a jail before. The Pitcairn case centered around a final number of 7 defendants, all accused of a litany of crimes against grown women and children. The charges included 21 counts of 41 counts of indecent and 2 counts of gross indecency with a. One of the accused was Steve Christian, who served as the island's dentist, engineer, and mayor. Steve was the leader of the community and a charming, intelligent man who got what he wanted most of the time. From his home, Steve and his small gang of right-hand men ran the island, cutting out anyone who had new ideas or thought things should change. They liked having the income from tourism, but anyone who wanted to shake things up on the island was unwelcome. A former Pitcairn teacher said, quote, it's their rock and they don't want anyone else on it, end quote. And Steve and his men were running the rock the way they wanted it to run, and that included maintaining a habit of underage and proclivities. Leslie Jacques, who acted as Pitcairn's commissioner at one time, said, quote, Pitcairn was an oligarchy. Steve ruled and everyone else did what they were told. The way the community was run was medieval, end quote. Other accused men included Steve's son, Randy, who was in charge of Pitcairn's influential internal committee, which handed out jobs, and Jay Warren, a former magistrate of the island. At this point, the detectives had amassed lots of evidentiary statements from victims, and islanders frankly confirmed that we're being raped on the island. But there were still lots of challenges to trying the accused. For one, officials weren't sure how many of the victims would be willing to testify, especially after facing pressure from their family and community, who felt the whole ordeal was overblown. Many of the locals were against the proceedings and worried that the trial would cripple the island. With a population of just 50, taking away 7 of the able-bodied men for an indefinite amount of time would also have certainly affected the functioning of Pitcairn and perhaps lead to its decline. Some even began to believe that the charges were being trumped up simply so the government had an excuse to shut down the island. They argued that by charging the men, officials had ensured that Pitcairn would no longer be able to carry on the way that it had for hundreds of years. Quote, "They've picked on all the viable young men, the ones who are the backbone of this place," end quote, said one resident. Residents thought that they were essentially being bullied, and that if the trial went on and the men were jailed, the island would fall apart from the inside. And aside from the logistical issues, the Pitcairn community wasn't convinced that anything needed to be done in the first place. They didn't want outsiders judging their way of life, and fathers, brothers, and husbands. And having been absent from the wider world for so long, they weren't convinced that the United Kingdom had any right to hold them to their laws. Vocal islanders slowed the process down with legal challenges, calling for the United Kingdom to halt the proceedings altogether. Defense lawyers argued that when the mutineers who had come to the island burned the HMS Bounty, they had renounced their citizenship, giving Britain no authority over them. They also argued that the island's isolation meant it wasn't practical, that they should be held to the same legal standards, and that Pitcairn residents had never been officially notified that the law applied to them. None of the arguments paid off, though, and the courts pointed out that while the islanders didn't want to follow UK law, they'd had no problem accepting the UK tax money and government support necessary for the island to survive. The court felt that not only was Pitcairn part of the United Kingdom, but islanders were more than well aware of what was and was not legal. So despite outrage from the small community, the case proceeded, though unique plans were drawn up to ensure the trial wouldn't destroy life on the island. Instead of bringing the 7 defendants to a court on the mainland, the trial came to Pitcairn itself. Lawyers, court officials, 3 judges, and 6 journalists came from New Zealand to Pitcairn, and their presence alone doubled the population of the island. In the lead up to the proceedings, the women of the island attended a meeting at Big Fence, the home of Olive Christian, Steve's wife. She and other Pitcairn women organized the gathering and invited the visiting media members to hear more about their side of the story. And again, disturbingly, all of the women who had been since they were babies, essentially, insisted that there was no crime happening on Pitcairn and that their men had been misjudged by the outside world. Every woman present was related to one of the defendants in some shape or form, whether as a mother, wife, sister, or aunt. Kathy Marks was one of the invited journalists, and she recalls well what the Pitcairn women had to say about their men. Quote, "They were decent, hard-working family types. No islander would tolerate children being interfered with, and no one on Pitcairn had ever been were girls who had known exactly what they were doing. It was they who had thrown themselves at the men." To the Pitcairn women, having at an early age was no issue. Many of them spoke up and recounted their attitudes to it. Quote, "It's been this way for generations, and we've seen nothing wrong in it. Everyone has young. That's our lifestyle," end quote, said Olive. Darrell Griffiths, the daughter of one of the defendants, said she had for the first time at "I felt shit hot about it, too. I felt like a big lady," she said. The reporters were taken aback, which surprised the Pitcairn women. They asked the media members at what age they had first had. Marks recalls their reaction to the news that those from the rest of the world were not having at such a young age. Quote, "The women of Pitcairn did not believe that anyone could have lost their at the idea of being that old was simply preposterous," end quote. While the meeting at Big Fence emphasized how deeply many of the women believed that was normal and consensual, it also seemed to show the incongruities in the women's thinking. One woman named Carol, who insisted that no girl had ever been on Pitcairn, also said that she did have a negative experience as a child, but that, quote, "It didn't affect me. I was probably luckier than some I've read about. It was tried, but nothing happened. I was 10 at the time, but even at I knew it was wrong. It's a bad thing. I screamed like hell," end quote. The reporters ultimately left the meeting shocked and confused. The women of Pitcairn seemed frank about the happening, but also totally open to it and okay with it, despite having negative experiences themselves. Girls and women from Pitcairn had openly admitted that as children, they had avoided doing chores alone so as not to be cornered by a man, and needed to learn who was and wasn't safe to be around. And yet they were incredibly quick to defend the men and their actions. In the end though, the opinions of the community didn't stop the trial from taking place, and after 7 weeks of legal proceedings, the verdicts were handed down. On October 24th, 2004, 6 of the 7 men accused were found guilty on 35 of the 55 charges. Only 1 man was acquitted of all charges. Though many islanders had been convinced the trial would be used to shut down the island, the judges considered the community's unique situation for the sentence. 2 of the defendants were only given 300 hours of community service, and the rest were sentenced to jail time ranging from 2 to 5 years. For the islanders, the punishment seemed unfair, but to the outside world, it obviously seemed way too little. How could these men, who had just been convicted of perpetrated against children starting at the age of get off with such a slap on the wrist? I mean, community service? What a joke. Though the sentences were short, the men were imprisoned in a brand new jail they had helped build on the island shortly before the trial, and eventually they were each released. And after that, life on Pitcairn Island seemed to just go on. Now, 20 years after the verdict, little has changed. The population continues to hover at around 50, and many of the men convicted of still live there on the island. Tourism to Pitcairn continues. In fact, if you want to book a room with the convicted and former mayor, you can even stay at the home of Steve and Olive Christian. Pitcairn's dirty secrets seem to have been forgotten by many, and one can't help but wonder, have things changed for the better on the island? Were the men convicted of those crimes reformed, or have they been allowed to remain in power away from the eyes of the wider world? What do they get up to when they aren't showing the island off to tourists? And are there tourists that come with the intention to take part in Pitcairn's legacy of... Well, to this day, no charges have ever been brought against visitors of the island since the 90s, but it's frightening to think about what may happen on Pitcairn Island when no one's around to see it. I mean, you had multiple people talking about visitors to the island that were taking part in, and I'm sure that there were so many more that were never talked about. Even in that initial group, what did they accuse? 30 or so men of taking part in this, and they only really charged 7 of them. And multiple of these women and these kids were talking about visitors to the island that joined in all of this. Like I said, who knows what sick, disturbing tourist, visited the island, had went back to his home country, talked about it with all of his friends, and then brought his friends over for a fun little bit of tourism with the... It's an island exactly like Epstein and North Fox, except this one is objectively, in its own way worse, because these children were being from an incredibly young age to be these almost, incredibly open machines that were to be used by the older men on the island, and it's disturbing. I mean, there are reports of the visitors coming, and I would love to know who those visitors were, because think about it. Those are people who once again escaped justice. So 7 out of 30, they didn't even get a third of the men that were accused of in this case, and they got none of the tourists. There's probably a guy from the United States, probably someone from Australia, probably someone from New Zealand, I don't know, someone from Europe, probably the United Kingdom, not gonna lie. They probably made their way over to the island, after a 3-month vacation, took the boat back to their country, and no one ever, knew about it or learned about it. I mean, think about it. Once they were there, they could have said their name was anything. I'm sure that they didn't have stringent ID checks when they arrived at the island. I could have gone there and said, my name's Robert Johnson. And then when I left, everyone would just, tell people, yeah, it was this white guy named Robert Johnson. I mean, there'd be a million of those people they could look at and have no evidence to prosecute. But there were confirmed to be visitors that engaged in this stuff to the island. So it's just bizarre thinking that these people went there, did that, they went back to their home countries, and they're still sitting there to this very day with no repercussions. None at all. One of those people could be watching this video. I'm sure they might, seeing Pitcairn Island, because it's a pretty niche topic. And yeah, they just completely got away with it. And as the boys in The Lord of the Flies struggle to survive on the island and bring order to the chaos, they live in fear of an imaginary beast they believe is hiding in the jungle. The beast haunts their dreams, and as they descend into deeper darkness, they grow to believe in this beast more and more. As the book The Lord of the Flies draws to a close, one boy realizes there might not be anything evil lurking in the jungle besides themselves. Maybe there is a beast, he says. Maybe it's only us. And in the end, that boy was right. The only beast truly terrorizing the boys in that novel is their inner wildness and fear, which drives them to fight amongst themselves and even kill each other. It's hard not to see the connections here to Pitcairn. There's no evil, no Lost-style monster that lives on the island lurking in the mist. Just humans far away from the world, from larger civilization, from authorities and prying eyes. And though humans are capable of incredible feats, they can also sink deep into the darkness, especially when there's no one around to see. A community that was born from mutineers and fugitives, Pitcairn was managed by men who grew accustomed to taking what they wanted, so much so that women on the island couldn't see the crimes for what they were. They had been completely since they were born to believe in these completely warped worldviews and to just go along with all of the and even encourage it. For centuries, the island lived with its own twisted form of normalcy, and perhaps still does to this very day. And if it does, who exactly is going to stop it? Those are our closing thoughts for today, and a deeply disturbing case here. I don't know the current situation on Pitcairn Island. I don't know if these kids are still being on there and what's exactly happening. Even if they're not outwardly on the surface, I guarantee that it's obviously still happening. I mean, you can't rehabilitate people like that. People that grew up doing that and were raised doing that. There's no way that you can just stop them from doing that. They're going to continue doing it until they're either put down or die naturally. But anyways, y'all, I want to thank Amelia GP for researching this story and writing this script and helping to make this thing possible. I want to thank everybody out there for listening this week, for watching the show. Please, if you're watching the show on YouTube, please leave me a comment, like the video, share the stuff out. I depend on you guys to help spread the word about this channel because they definitely aren't videos that YouTube or these platforms really want to, get out there. So it really depends on you guys showing people that this is what we want to see and this should be supported and shown to more people. Also, if you're listening to the show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you can listen to the show completely uncensored, by the way, on there. Please leave me a 5-star review. Let me know what you think of it. And yeah, as always, guys, we'll be back next week. We're covering some islands in the next few weeks, so get ready. There's some even more disturbing ones that we're going to dive into. But as always, thanks for tuning in. Keep that tinfoil hat on. Always stay suspicious, and I'll catch y'all next week.